Good morning, and welcome to Light of Christ Live. Today's passage is from Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 10 and 13. And so if you'd like to grab a Bible, pause the video and grab a Bible, take a look at the verse, this would be a great time. The passage says, "When Jesus returned to Capernaum, a Roman officer came and pleaded with him, 'Lord, my young servant lies in bed, paralyzed and in terrible pain.' Jesus said, 'I will come and heal him.' But the officer said, 'Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come into my home. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I am under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need say, go, and they go, or come, and they come. And if I say to my slaves, do this, they do it." It says, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to those who were following him, he said, "I tell you the truth, I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel." And it says, then Jesus said to the Roman officer, "Go back home, because you believed, it has happened." And the young servant was healed in that same hour. Well, this past week, my daughter was talking with a friend of hers who lives on the West Coast. And this friend shared a little bit of her experience with the coronavirus situation on the West Coast. And I found it to be interesting, so I wanted to share it with you this morning. This friend went to a chain drugstore to get some medications that she needed. And when she arrived at the drugstore, there was this huge line of people, almost wrapping around the entire store. And so she was like, oh my. But she resigned herself to becoming part of the line because she needed the medications. But what she found is as the line moved along, she discovered that this incredibly long line wasn't for the drugstore at all. It was for the liquor store next door. In fact, there was no line for the drugstore at all. It was all for the liquor store. And so it made me stop and think, why, with the outbreak of the coronavirus, that it was the liquor store that was most popular? And I came up with three possibilities. And I'm sure at home you can come up with some other possibilities. I thought maybe they had been told that alcohol kills germs. And so they were going to take care of the thing from the inside out. Second, I thought they finally realized that they don't have to go to work. And so the party was about to begin. Or three, and this is what I want to talk about with you today, that they were engaging in a form of escapism. That they wanted to dull the anxiety that they were feeling because of their new situation. So in a sense, they were emotionally paralyzed by their new circumstances. And I think that today's Bible lesson does a very good job of having some helpful insight for all of us. who feel a little bit out of sorts with the coronavirus situation. So let's take a look at the lesson. If you take a look in verse 6, the Roman officer comes to Jesus and he says, "Lord, my young servant lies in bed." Maybe something you're doing right now. Paralyzed. And in terrible pain. Because of this text, this week I looked up the definition of paralysis. And what I found interesting is I found that it has two meanings. One meaning is medical, which is probably what we're familiar with. And it means the complete or partial loss of muscle function. But the other meaning has to do with how a person might respond in difficult circumstances. It is the inability to act or function in a person, an organization, or a place. And in today's lesson, we see the potential for both types of paralysis. The young servant has the muscular type of paralysis, but the officer runs the risk of having the second type of paralysis, the inability to act or function in this difficult situation. And so for our benefit, I want us to look at this potentially paralyzing situation because I believe it has direct application to our current situation. But before I go on to take a look at the Roman officer's response to the situation, I want us to truly understand who this man is and how his training helps him and how it can help us in this potentially paralyzing situation that we find ourselves. In the original Greek text of the New Testament, this passage, instead of describing this man as a Roman officer, it instead reads centurion. And that was his title in the Roman army. And the term centurion, just like other words starting with the letters C-E-N-T, means 100. Just like century means 100 years. And so this man is in command of 100 other men. And so this is a man who, probably like you, is usually very self-sufficient. He can take care of himself. And not only is he self-sufficient, but his title shows that he is capable of leading and directing the 100 soldiers under his command. So this is a man who is usually very capable, very much in control. And that's what he's used to, being in control. And my guess is that that's probably what you're used to as well, at least in certain aspects of your life. A sense of control. But here, we see that this in-control individual is now overwhelmed. With his young servant paralyzed, he's clearly out of his depth. And so there's the potential to be emotionally paralyzed by this new change of events. And in that way, I think that this centurion situation is much like the situation we currently find ourselves in. We may feel overwhelmed. We may feel like we're out of our depth. And we may feel, at least to some degree, paralyzed by all the uncertainty. So how does he respond to his situation? After sharing his troubling situation with Jesus, and Jesus responding, "I will come and heal him." It's very interesting. The officer says to Jesus, "Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come into my home. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed." This is very important for us. The very first thing this Roman officer does in this potentially emotionally paralyzing situation is he recognizes who he is talking to. Right? Because of his military training, this is a man who understands power. He understands authority, and he understands rank. And he realizes his inadequacy in this situation and the great adequacy of Jesus. And we'll see that that's the key. But let me just stop here and say that I think we often lose sight of this and respond differently. And let me give you an example from my own life. When I was younger, I worked a summer at a naval base. And so I worked as a civilian in a commissary. And one day I woke up and I wasn't feeling so well, so I called in sick. However, the officer, who was my boss, told me that I had to come in. And so being a little miffed by this, I responded to him on the phone, directly with him. I said, "All right, I'll come in. But if I throw up, you'll have to clean it up." Now I want you to think about that response for just a moment. How many of you think that that was a good response? Jeff Foxworthy became famous with the line, "You know that you're a redneck when..." But you see, my line would have been, "You know you're young and too full of yourself when you're in a military setting like that, and that's your response." And so my question to you is, what was my problem? And I'm sure there were a few problems I had, but I just want you to think of this. What was I not seeing? You see, I didn't recognize his power. I didn't recognize his authority. And I didn't really understand who was in control of things. And so I acted that day, and probably other days, as if I was in control. This centurion's first wise move, and something we should take note of, comes in his recognizing that he is in no way Jesus' equal. That he's in the presence of someone with great power, with great authority, and the understanding that Jesus has the ability to help him. And this is really the key to our dealing with our current crisis. You see, we may be out of our depth. We may be feeling like we're not in control of things. We may be feeling totally out of our league. But you see, the truth is the Roman officer was right. He truly understood that Jesus had more than enough, easy for you to say, more than enough to help him through this change of circumstances. And so if we were to learn a lesson from this Roman officer, it would be to take the time to truly consider and understand that there is someone who is not overwhelmed by this situation that we find ourselves in. There's someone who's not out of his league. And there's someone who never lost control. And that is God. That is God. And so I want us to take just a moment to listen to the power that this Roman officer sees in Jesus. He says to Jesus, just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. He says, I know this because I'm under the authority of my superior officers. And I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say go, and they go. Or come, and they come. And if I say to my slaves, do this, they do it. Let me ask you, do you think that this centurion recognized the power and the authority that Jesus has? The power implied here is immense. That Jesus could just utter a word, and someone a considerable distance from him, the healing would just come to pass. Think about that for a moment. Jesus didn't need to go make a diagnosis. He doesn't need to see what approach would be best. He doesn't need to start some medical procedure. He didn't need to apply medications. You see, he's able in and of himself to heal this young boy. And again, we see the benefit of this man's military training in helping him understand all this. You see, he understands what it's like to depend on someone with great and true power. For him, 100 other soldiers regularly depended on him. Depended on him to make proper decisions. Depended on him to look out for them in very unnerving and very difficult circumstances. The heat of the battle. Change in how the battle came about. The fog of war. All that in the midst of a battle. And now in this emotionally paralyzing situation, this centurion now puts his faith in Jesus. He relies on Jesus to be in control and to look out for him. Let me just end by saying this. In my room at home, I have a framed quote from Martin Luther, the great reformer. And this is what that quote says. Luther wrote, I've held many things in my hands. And I've lost them all. But whatever I have placed in God's hands, that I still possess. When I think about that quote, it makes me understand that Martin Luther truly understood who was in control, who truly had power, who truly had authority, and who could take care of him. And so he placed his life in God's hands. And that's the same thing I see with this Roman officer. And in verse 13, we see the results. Then Jesus said to the Roman officer, "Go back home. Because you believed, it has happened." And the young servant was healed at that very same hour. And so in this lesson, what I find interesting is that two people were healed of paralysis. The young servant through a miracle, and the Roman officer through placing his faith in Jesus Christ, and Jesus' power and authority and compassion. And so I hope if you have any vestiges of paralysis from the fear of this situation that we find ourselves in right now, that you find peace through understanding that we can trust in Jesus. And with that peace, we can relax and move ahead without any personal paralysis at all. That we can, as individuals, be fully functional again with no paralysis. And so I say to you, may God's peace be with you. Amen.